It's February 12th of 1994. Officer Carter from the Thornton Police Department is arriving for work, and sitting in front of the Thornton PD is a running car. It's gone up over the curb, and it's sitting in the grass. All he's trying to do is come to work. And he discovers that work has come to him.
He didn't know whether this was a drunk driver crash or otherwise.
He goes into police officer mode and bails out of his car to see what's happening. There is a woman behind the wheel covered in blood. She has suffered multiple gunshot wounds.
Help me, please. He shot me. Please.
She was able to communicate that a passenger in her car had been abducted by a man.
There's another victim in the hands of the shooter, and he's fled off into the early morning light. She said, this just happened. You have to find him. He's got that woman.
I'm Rick Archer. I'm a retired Thornton Police Department detective. I would never introduce myself that way. I'd introduce myself, hi, I'm Rick. Anyway, I was in college at Indiana State University, and I had full intent on going to law school. Just was not the lid that fit my pot. So, like, I've got this great education. What do I do with it? I guess I'll become a police officer. I hit my stride when I was moved into detectives. I got to use more brain power and ultimately was named as the lead homicide investigator. I was sound asleep, enjoying rest, which I rarely got. Then I just got a call from patrol sergeant. There's not a lot of times you end up with a shooting victim on the front lawn of the Thornton Police Department. So just the circumstances were really unique.
Detective Rick Archer is summoned to handle a crime scene at his own police department. Somewhat odd. We don't provide curb service, but sometimes we have to.
So I get over there and I take a look around the scene. And there it is. A gold Cadillac in the front lawn of the Thornton Police Department. Driver's side door and passenger side door open. There was blood throughout the interior.
Archer looks more closely at the car, sees bullet holes in the driver's door, and sees a bullet hole in the seat.
There was also evidence of somebody having been drugged from the passenger side into the street. And they're telling me that there's a possibly abducted woman as part of this. And your mind just races trying to figure out, okay, what resources am I going to need?
The only person that knows details is in a Denver hospital. The EMTs are not confident that this woman's going to survive.
From that point, I send a team of 2 detectives to the hospital so that if Jackie's able to provide any statements pre-surgery, we have somebody there to get them.
Some people have a very strong will to live, and that's obviously the case with this girl. She has suffered 3 gunshot wounds, but she's with us. And she is conscious.
Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. Can you state your full name for me, please?
Jackie Criazo.
Jackie, can you tell me about the events which occurred yesterday?
I had left my apartment at 5:30 in the morning, was heading to my dad's house. I was going eastbound on I-76, and as I made the turn coming along, I saw emergency flashers going and all that.
and she thinks maybe they need some assistance of some kind, and she pulls over behind the car and stops.
It was a small blue Geo Metro.
And all of a sudden, a girl, not wearing a top, runs to her car, jerks the door open.
She jumped in the car. She was screaming that he had been raping her and she needed to get the heck out of there.
And so Jackie took off.
What was her attitude like?
She was hysterical.
The girl told her her name was Rhonda Maloney. She got off work and she was driving back home when she got rear-ended by a car. It just bumped her. So she stopped to see what the damage was. And when she got out of the car, she was immediately attacked.
She said that he had raped her for 2 hours, and she said she didn't know who he was or where he'd come from. So I went through the intersection and knew I could go to the police station at 92nd.
So now they've driven only a short distance. The car the girl got out of begins to immediately chase them.
He sped up and tried to get alongside of me. At that time, he just started rapid fire.
The driver of the car continued firing on them all the way up the highway.
Jackie feels herself get hit with a bullet, multiple gunshot wounds, but she continues to drive. She's determined to reach the police.
At some point, she realized that her legs weren't working.
And that's when I lost control of my vehicle, and I tried to turn it into where I was headed.
And ended up coming to rest on the lawn of the Thornton Police Department.
That's normally when a criminal goes the other way. Not this guy. He's not done yet. This guy looks directly at her, points the gun at her face.
And he screamed at me that I should keep my mouth shut or else he was going to kill me.
Rhonda was curled up in a ball on the passenger side. The fella pulled Rhonda out, saying something like, "You thought you were going to get away."
She was screaming that she couldn't see and that she was in all kinds of pain.
He drags this screaming woman back to his car and they drive off.
I got the impression it was his intention that she was going to die.
Good God, who are we dealing with here? Is this Jack the Ripper?
When he leaned over in the car, that was the best look I got at him.
He was described as a younger, light-skinned, moon-faced black male.
She says his face is burned into my mind. She's a very good witness.
What kind of car was he driving?
A Saturn, a late model Saturn.
The reason that was unique to us was just there weren't a lot of Saturns out. I don't think most people even knew what a Saturn was in those days. So at that point in time, the immediate thing is to find Rhonda.
Anytime a kidnapping has occurred, the urgency is absolutely extreme. The only way for a kidnapping to end and for a criminal to ensure his escape is to kill the victim.
Our focus was trying to find that Saturn. We had already requested assistance from the Air National Guard to come out with helicopters and do anything they could for us.
They do a search of the area and they find nothing.
Jackie had told us where Rhonda's car was, and we went down there.
Rhonda's vehicle was a small blue Geo, and it had some minor damage on it.
There's a fresh dent in the rear of Rhonda Maloney's car.
There was some footprints, there were some tire tracks. We had nothing else.
Archer is thinking about this case now as the pursuit hopefully begins soon on the Saturn, and he remembers something. An intelligence report he read several years before about a girl who wound up murdered in Estes Park in 1988, 70 miles northwest of the Thornton Police Department.
So at that point in time, I reached out to Larimer County and I got a copy of their case file. It had never been solved. And reading through the case file, this Jessica Arredondo just literally vanished.
There are moments in cases where something comes to light and it just strikes you as like a lightning bolt. That happens to Archer. And he wonders, could this be the same guy? The search continues for Rhonda Maloney without success. But Archer believes he's dealing with someone who's a repeat offender. He then reaches out to the Larimer County Sheriff's Department and asks to speak to the detective who worked the Jessica Arredondo case in 1988, and he's put in touch with Detective Toppenberg.
I didn't know Toppenberg, but I hear a lot of really, really, really good things about John.
I'm John Toppenberg, retired deputy with the Larimer County Sheriff's Department. I retired as a detective working major crimes.
Detective Archer, Toppenberg.
There were obvious similarities between these two cases. This particular case started with people that were going south out of Rocky Mountain National Park.
This is really nice.
Oh, it's beautiful here.
Two tourists are returning from an early morning visit to Rocky Mountain National Park. They spot another overlook next to the highway, turnouts where you can go and take photographs. And then they find something horrible. They observe the naked body of a female lying in the rocks.
Officer, how are you?
Detective John Toppenberg from the Larimer County Sheriff's Department responds to the scene.
From examination of the scene, it was obvious that the body was airborne for a short while and came to rest 26 feet from where she was thrown.
There were tire tracks that indicated a car pulled in to the turnout and threw it over the embankment.
She was without clothes when she was thrown over the edge. It was obvious that she had sustained significant trauma to major portions of her body.
The body shows signs of sexual assault. Her face shows evidence of enormous blunt trauma. She's been kicked, she's been stomped. Her teeth are caved in backwards, still in her mouth.
This was perpetrated with purpose, with emotion.
This is someone who is enjoying what he's doing. He is in a wild rage.
We did not know who the victim was. It became clear that a missing person case in Denver coordinated with the description of the victim.
The girl is Jessica Arredondo, who just turned 21 years of age. She is from a Denver suburb.
We followed up with Joe Arredondo, the victim's father.
I was just so sad that happened. We were hoping for the best, but no, it just was terrible what happened. Jessica was very sly and very beautiful. She was very, very bubbly. She was a head cheerleader, and she was very popular. She got along with everybody.
This is just a young girl starting her life, age 21, has her first job. She works at U.S. West as a telephone operator.
We were really, really proud of Jessica. She's just a perfect daughter. The last time I saw her was on that Friday night, and she had plans to go out with a boyfriend. They were going to go out that night to a nightclub.
And at the last minute, she decided she wasn't feeling well and didn't want to go.
All right, babe.
She said, I'll take you down there to the club, and I can leave you off there, and I'll come back and pick you up. So that's what she did. She took him to the club, and that's it.
She drops him at the bar, says she'll be back in an hour, and she never returns. The father says that the night she disappeared, she was driving a new car she had just purchased.
An 88 Mustang, and she had to have that car. She loved that car so much, she didn't want any scratches or anything to happen to it.
And the next question is obvious. Where is that car? So Toppenberg was out of Bolo to all law enforcement agencies, Denver Metro. Within hours, the Mustang is found.
The vehicle's proximity to the bar was it was at least a mile away.
So Toppenberg arrives at this car. The hazard lights are flashing. The keys are in the ignition. Now, this is this girl's dream to own this brand new car. Is she going to walk away? No.
It would be speculative, but obviously there would have been a kidnapping, violent kidnapping, where she was taken.
Toppenberg looks more closely at the car, and he notices fresh rear end damage, as if she's been tapped from the rear by someone in a car. What if the driver of that car is the killer, and he is trying to get her to stop? She puts her four-way flashers on and gets out of her car to check the damage of her dream machine.
What the hell, man?
He gets out of his car and grabs her by the throat. And now she's gone and winds up thrown off a cliff on Highway 36.
But as that case progressed, we ran into way too many dead ends.
The Arredondo case goes cold, dormant. Until February 1994.
It looked like it was a case basically like Rhonda. If I didn't know better, I'd say the same person who killed her killed Jessica Arredondo.
Our killer's MO is the use of a fender bender, all for a simple reason. It's successful.
The Arredondo case came into sharp focus the moment the Rhonda Maloney case came into view. And there was no looking back.
Archer and Toppenberg are both convinced this is the same fellow. Using this same technique. This is him. Archer and Toppenberg are investigating two cases. It's the current case of the missing Miss Maloney, who still hasn't been found, and of course the death 6 years earlier of Jessica Arredondo. These are girls from the Denver suburb. They were hit from the rear by another vehicle.
And I was literally just matching Toppenberg's case to my suspect, who had the exact same MO.
I don't recall having any real question about whether that was perpetrated by the same suspect. It all fit.
This is only the beginning of this case. And there's about to be another murder if we don't find that girl.
At that point, we were still searching for Rhonda, and that was Saturn. So I start reaching out to Rhonda's family, because that's where we wanted to start. Where did she come from? Where was she going? Why was she wherever she was when she was abducted?
My name is Carrie Gemeinhart. I'm Rhonda Maloney's sister. Rhonda was my best friend. We spent the majority of our time together growing up. She was always with me. We pretty much did everything together. Rhonda was a happy person who was lively and funny and had a great sense of humor and could live life to the fullest. At the time that this happened, it was myself, Rhonda, my brother-in-law, Carrie, and my mom. We all lived in the house together in Broomfield. They told us that they had found Rhonda's car on the side of the highway. You know it's not going to be good at that point. Rick Archer made quite an impression on me. He just seemed very focused.
You have to be understanding and patient while professionally pushing for the answers you need. It was really established early on that Rhonda had been at work.
She works in a casino in one of the mountain towns close to Denver, where gambling is permitted.
Rhonda was a cocktail waitress. She loved it. She made great money. She was really happy up there. She had to work the later shift, 6 to 2 in the morning, because that's when the casinos closed.
You're looking for a sexual predator, and here we have a pretty young woman who works in a casino as a cocktail waitress. Has our man been a customer in that casino?
We just had no idea. It was very important to get into the Central City casinos to review security footage, because as we all know, a lot can happen in a corner where somebody else isn't going to see it. We wanted to know if there was a casual connection with Rhonda and a young black man up there that could have expanded into something like this. Maybe somebody was a little handsy or a little bit too interested.
Archer reviews all of that to see to it that, yes, she was at work that night. Normal hours, no confrontations, no one followed her out the door. She left work when her shift was over and was headed home. So that reveals nothing to him. It's now been 24 hours since Rhonda Maloney was dragged out of the front yard of the Thornton Police Department, and we still have not found her. The search for the car continues, but no result.
So at that point in time, we actually returned to the initial scene where Rhonda's car was. Now, the car was already gone because we'd impounded it.
The crime scene is all you've got. And when you're not getting anywhere, you go back and start over. Look again, see something new. Who knows?
The scene down on I-76, it was dynamic. It was changing, not even daily, it was changing hourly based on traffic flow and weather conditions.
They spent hours canvassing that scene, and a detective walking up towards the abutment, which was some ways away from the car, he saw a black shape that was in the snow.
He heard something in the snow and walked over and found a pager, something that nobody else had seen.
This is 1994. People carried pagers. A little box that hooks in your belt, tied to a telephone number, where someone can transmit information to you.
They were able to turn the pager on and discovered that it had a message on there that says, "This is Belt Harlan, Detective Sergeant, Denver Police Department. If you found this pager, please return it to me at the Denver Police."
What's a Denver PD pager doing here? What if our sexual predator killer is a cop? Archer is shocked to discover this pager belongs to a Denver Police Department detective. What is it doing at a crime scene of a kidnapping and an attempted murder?
We pretty quickly put together a lot of information on Belt Harlan. Belt Harlan had a challenging career at the Denver Police Department.
He had got angry at someone in the drive-up lane, and he tried to climb through the window of the drive-up place to get at this guy. He was known for having a terrible temper.
If a policeman decides to start committing crimes, he's a dangerous criminal indeed. He knows the game.
We knew he had a troubled past, but the primary thing was that he didn't even come close to matching the description of our suspect.
He was older, up in age, darker skinned, nothing at all like the description that Jackie gave.
Around that same time, my partner, through his computer work at DMV, found a Saturn with the plate number Cha-Ching. This really interested us because we really felt that that was the sound that a one-armed bandit makes at the casinos, is Cha-Ching when it pays out.
He is a gambler. Well, no. Miss Maloney is a waitress in a casino. He does some more checking, and he finds that the owner of that car is Robert Harlan.
Robert was a light-skinned black man with a moon face and young.
We're not looking at a detective here. We're looking at a detective's son.
It was the craziest thing I'd ever seen. Craziest thing.
So he looks up Mr. Robert Harlan. What Archer is amazed by is the length and depth of his criminal record.
Robert Harlan was a bad egg. Robert Harlan had many, many allegations of sexual assault, many, many allegations of sexual harassment in the workplace.
In addition to that, Archer discovers something else. He worked at US West, which is where Arredondo worked. He worked there when she worked there 6 years ago. He is the perfect candidate for who we're looking for.
This is our guy. So at that point in time, in our world, it was called balls to the wall. This was the most dynamic case I have ever seen in my life. Things were unfolding so rapidly. Our focus was trying to find Rhonda. And in a case like this, we always use SWAT.
In the cop world, everything is RFN. Right now. I need a SWAT team. I need 100 policemen. I need a helicopter. Whatever it is you require is going to show up right now.
We knew he was armed. Absolutely knew he wasn't afraid to shoot. So we use explosive entry and flashbangs.
A flashbang detonates, creating this enormous noise which will deafen anybody for a few seconds, and a brilliant flash of light that will blind you. You are completely disoriented, you can't hear, and you can't see, and that's the point.
The SWAT team made a dynamic entry into the grandmother's house, and we found Robert Harlan in his bedroom. We woke him out of a sound sleep. We took him into custody with literally no issues whatsoever.
Here is Robert Harlan. There is no Miss Maloney. Where is she? They've got a canine with them. The canine hits on the car. They can see in the windows, nothing's in the car, but they can't see into the trunk. Archer is concerned he's going to find something horrible in the trunk of this machine. Archer opens the trunk and it's empty. Where is she and what did he do with her?
We transported Robert back to Thornton Police Department. My sergeant informed me that he had selected 2 other detectives to conduct the interviews with Robert and that I was supposed to go home to get some rest. I just explained to him that's not ever going to happen.
Okay, before we even get started, Robert, do you have any idea why you might be down here?
Not really.
Robert Harlan was wrapped in this blanket and speaking very softly. Of course, Rhonda was missing, and they were still hopeful to some degree that they might find her alive.
So where am I going to find her?
I don't know where she is. I'm telling you the truth. I don't remember being with her. None of that.
Deny, deny, deny. That's what he does.
Jessica Ariando? Who was she? She was a co-worker. I don't know anything about that, man.
I was watching the interview and I was watching Robert just run the entire thing. And after a bit, I just walked to the interview room, opened the door, and said, "You 2 are done. Out."
Archer came in, fresh face and a new sort of approach.
Robert, look at me. Don't play this chick routine with me. Where is she?
First thing, right in the door. I was like, okay, you're not in charge here. I am.
If I find Rhonda and she's dead, I'm gonna come after you with both barrels because you lied to me. And I don't like to be lied to, okay?
Up to this point, he's been able to play the victim. Well, now you have somebody who's going head-to-head with him.
What I want is I want you to tell me about Rhonda. And I want you to look at her. And I want you to remember how it felt. Okay, hey, I might have sold some drugs. You might have okay, whatever.
What does he do? He puts himself with the victim. He says for the purpose of selling drugs. We say for the purpose of rape and murder. But he puts himself with her. And that is significant.
So she gets in your car, you get in her car. How's that work, man? She got my car. She got in your car. Mm-hmm.
I was starting to get to him. And this has been part of my training for all those years, is to continue down that path.
Obviously, there's something that really pissed you off. Something happened out there. And I'd like to know what it was. The thing is...
And behold, there's a knock at the door because an attorney showed up at our police department. And it put a stop to everything. Everything.
What's that feeling like?
It was horrible. It was absolutely horrible because I knew that he was ready to give me his version of the rape.
So they're left with no confession, a few incriminating things maybe, but ultimately the case stands as it is. But the next day, Archer's in his office and gets a call from the front desk that Robert Harlan's father, Detective Belt Harlan, is there to see him. And he's carrying a cardboard box.
So Belt told us that he received a call from his other son who said that the day before Robert had come by his place, was fully covered in blood, asked if he could take a shower.
He took his shirt off and he took out a gun.
He left his gun there, borrowed his brother's car, and went, what we assume is looking for his pager.
And that's how that evidence was brought into the case. The gun that shot Rhonda and that had her blood on it, and the clothing that Robert had been wearing that had her blood on it.
It takes an amazing person and a strength of character to be able to turn evidence in and admit that your son's the killer.
now Archer has hard physical evidence. Robert is bought and paid for this case. But they still don't know what happened to Miss Maloney.
3 days after taking Robert Harlan into custody, I received a call. It was a road out in Adams County called Imboden Road. And a small bridge over a ditch or creek. And underneath the bridge was Rhonda's body.
This girl is naked, savagely beaten and tortured.
Shattered jaw, shattered eye sockets, in addition to a bullet that was fired into her forehead. I was at that business for 28 years, and I've seen some horrendous crime scenes, and this is one of the most horrendous in terms of the injuries done to Rhonda Maloney.
When they found her, I was with my dad, and I saw the look on his face. And all I remember was screaming at him, no, don't say anything, because I knew as soon as I saw him.
Her family was very much, all we want is for him to be convicted, and that's all we need.
Robert Harlan goes on trial for the first-degree murder of Rhonda Maloney and the attempted first-degree murder of Jackie Carrazzo. In the autopsy, the toxicology report came back negative. This totally unravels Harlan's statement about selling this girl drugs. She doesn't use drugs.
We presented evidence that showed that Harlan was a sociopath, that he was a predator, and it was the way of his life.
The idea of surveilling and selecting a victim in advance makes it plausible that Robert Harlan followed Rhonda Maloney's vehicle after she left work at the casino. He caused a minor vehicle accident causing her to stop. She got out of her car to look for damage. He was able to get her into his car, raping her at gunpoint for 2 hours.
Jackie came around the corner. Jackie stops, and then it's a foot race. Robert goes running towards them, trying to stop them. Hence, in the process, lost his pager.
Harlan fired at the car as he pursued it as they tried to escape from him until they crashed in the front yard of the Thornton PD. So he grabbed the victim again and dragged her out of that car back into his. He ended Rhonda's life that night and put her body in a place where he thought no one would ever be able to find.
Obviously, the central piece in this case was Jackie. She was shot in the spine that caused her paralysis, and she testified bravely, incredibly detailed. It's just amazing.
Jury finds him guilty of first-degree murder, of attempted first-degree murder, first-degree sexual assault, and second-degree kidnapping. Mr. Robert Harlan will spend his life behind bars. Robert Harlan never admitted to the murder of Jessica Arredondo. There was never enough evidence found or presented to move anywhere forward with charging him with the homicide.
If it had not been for his attorney, we would have certainly gone and interviewed him. It left me with a feeling of frustration, a feeling of anger.
We think he's involved, but he has never admitted or even said anything about it. We keep on hoping that something will come up and we'll be able to know what really happened.
I think this case was really important. It left me feeling really proud of everything that we had accomplished. Proud and sad because I didn't think Rhonda's family would ever really get over it.
Her birthday, I go up to the cemetery and I'll go sit and talk to her. And I tell her all the time I love her. Miss her. I never want Rhonda to be forgotten.
Robert Harlan is exceptionally dangerous. He is sociopathic. I don't believe that he sat still for 6 years. This guy is a sexual predator. I'm sure he committed other rapes in that interim, but there's no proof that he did. You often hear people say there's good in everyone. I disagree. Not everyone.
At exactly 2:17 a.m., a security camera flickered, skipped a frame, and then caught a single blurred silhouette crossing an empty street under a broken streetlight, a shape that should have meant nothing, a shadow swallowed by darkness, except that 14 hours later, the body of 17-year-old Emily Carter would be found less than 200 yards away, and in the years that followed, that flickering image would become the most replayed, most dissected, most haunting piece of footage in the history of the small coastal town of Bay Harbor, Florida. A town where nothing ever happened, a town that locked its doors but left its windows open, a town that believed evil belonged somewhere else, until the night it arrived without warning and never truly left. Emily had been last seen at a late-shift diner just after midnight, laughing with coworkers, tying her hair back, complaining about the humidity, the air thick with the promise of an approaching storm, the kind of Florida night that felt heavy on the lungs. She clocked out at 12:43 a.m., stepped into the parking lot, and waved once at a friend before getting into her silver Honda Civic. That wave would become a frozen memory, replayed endlessly by those who loved her, a small gesture that now carried the unbearable weight of finality. She never made it home. Her car was found the next morning abandoned near the marina, the driver's door slightly ajar, her purse still inside, phone missing, keys gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no shattered glass, no blood, just silence, and the slow, creeping realization that something had gone terribly wrong. By noon, the town was in lockdown. Patrol cars blocked intersections. Helicopters traced slow circles above the coastline. Divers swept the murky water beneath the docks, their bubbles rising like whispered prayers. Volunteers combed mangroves and abandoned lots, calling Emily's name until their voices broke. Flyers went up on every lamppost, every storefront, every gas station door, her senior portrait staring back in glossy ink, wide smile, hopeful eyes, the face of someone who still believed the world was mostly kind. The body was discovered at dusk, deep in a thicket of saw palmetto, hidden from the road, hidden from the casual glance, hidden as though deliberately erased. She had been strangled. No weapon, no witnesses, no obvious motive. The medical examiner estimated time of death between 1:30 and 3 a.m., placing her final moments squarely within the window captured by that flickering camera. One blurred silhouette, one empty street, one town desperate for answers. The shock was immediate and absolute. Bay Harbor had not recorded a homicide in over a decade. Violent crime statistics barely registered. Parents let children ride bikes after dark. Doors were locked more out of habit than fear. Now, a killer had walked among them, unseen, unrecognized, and vanished without a trace. Detectives descended on the case with urgency bordering on obsession. Every friend, every coworker, every neighbor, every customer from the diner. They reconstructed Emily's last day minute by minute, tracing her steps through receipts, time cards, and grainy surveillance footage. They collected fingerprints from her car, DNA from beneath her fingernails, fibers from her clothing. They searched her phone records, her text messages, her social media, looking for hints of secret relationships, hidden conflicts, anything that might explain why a teenager with no known enemies would end up dead in the dark. Rumors erupted instantly. A jealous ex-boyfriend, a stalker customer, a drug deal gone wrong, a passing drifter. Each theory ignited briefly before collapsing under scrutiny. The ex-boyfriend had airtight alibis. The regular customers were vetted, interrogated, cleared. No drugs. No gang connections. No secret double life. Emily, by every account, was exactly who she appeared to be. A bright, hard-working student, saving money for college, helping her mother pay rent, dreaming of escaping the gravitational pull of a town that suddenly felt far too small. Then came the evidence that changed everything and nothing at once. The forensic lab identified an unknown male DNA profile on Emily's clothing. Not a match to anyone in local, state, or federal databases. A ghost. A genetic fingerprint with no name. Investigators believed they had their killer's signature, yet had no way to attach it to a face. It was the promise of resolution and the agony of uncertainty fused into a single line of data. Weeks turned into months.
Tips poured in. Hundreds of them.
Most were useless. Some were cruel hoaxes. Others were fueled by paranoia. Neighbors turning on neighbors, old grudges resurfacing, friendships fraying under the strain of suspicion. Every unfamiliar car became a threat. Every stranger, a possible predator. Bay Harbor transformed from a postcard town into a place of locked windows, drawn curtains, and whispered conversations. As the first anniversary approached, hope began to thin. Detectives followed leads into dead ends. Witnesses recanted. Evidence degraded. Media attention drifted to newer tragedies. Emily's face slowly disappeared from national headlines, replaced by the next breaking story, the next fleeting outrage. But in Bay Harbor, time had frozen at 2:17 a.m., trapped between a flickering frame and a single unanswered question. Who? Years slipped by. The case files grew thicker. The urgency dulled, not from indifference, but from exhaustion. Investigators were reassigned. Promotions came. Retirements followed. New detectives inherited old boxes filled with transcripts, photographs, and unspeakable possibilities. Each fresh set of eyes saw the same thing, a perfect storm of lost opportunity, where the right clue might have been overlooked, the right suspect dismissed, the right moment missed forever. Emily's mother, Laura Carter, refused to let the case fade. She held annual vigils by the marina, lighting candles that trembled in the ocean wind, their reflections shattering across the black water. She spoke at town halls, pleaded with journalists, wrote letters to state officials, her grief hardening into relentless determination. If the system would not remember her daughter, she would force it to. Then, in the fall of 2018, something shifted. A cold case task force, newly funded and newly armed with advancements in forensic technology, reopened dozens of unsolved homicides across Florida. Emily Carter's file landed on the desk of Detective Aaron Wolf, a man known for methodical patience and an almost unsettling ability to notice what others ignored. He read every page. He watched the surveillance footage until his eyes burned. He reconstructed the timeline, not looking for what happened, but for what shouldn't have. It was Wolf who noticed the anomaly. The silhouette in the 2:17 a.m. footage moved with a slight, uneven gait, a limp so subtle it had been dismissed as distortion. Frame by frame, he slowed the clip, mapping the rhythm of the steps. Left foot.
Pause.
Right foot. Short drag. Again. Not a camera glitch. Not random motion. A physical irregularity. Wolf cross-referenced medical records tied to known residents within a 2-mile radius of the marina. Men. Ages 20 to 50. Prior injuries. Surgeries. Physical disabilities. The list was long, but not endless. One name surfaced again and again, not because of criminal history, but because of proximity and timing. Daniel Hargreave. A 42-year-old volunteer firefighter. Lifelong resident. Widower. No criminal record. Known for helping neighbors fixing fences, coaching Little League. He had suffered a severe knee injury 5 years before Emily's murder, the result of a boating accident, leaving him with a permanent limp. His house sat less than 3 blocks from the marina. To the town, Daniel was invisible in the way only familiar figures become.
Trusted.
Unremarkable.
Safe.
Wolf dug deeper. On the night Emily vanished, Daniel had reported an early morning fire alarm call at 3:12 a.m., placing him awake, dressed, and mobile during the estimated time of death. His alibi rested solely on his own word and the delayed logs of a volunteer system notorious for sloppy documentation. The DNA sample from 2007 was reprocessed using advanced genealogical databases, the kind that mapped familial connections across millions of public profiles. Weeks passed, then months. Then, quietly, the lab returned a result that made the room go still. A partial familial match. Not to Daniel, but to a distant relative living in Georgia. The family tree led back, branch by branch, until it terminated at a single individual in Bay Harbor. Daniel Hargreave. When detectives knocked on his door, he smiled, offered coffee, answered every question with calm cooperation. He provided a fresh DNA sample without hesitation. He spoke warmly of Emily, remember her from fundraisers, charity events, town picnics. He said her death had broken his heart. The results came back 2 weeks later. A match. The same genetic code lifted from Emily's clothing 11 years earlier now sat in a sterile evidence bag labeled with Daniel's name. The arrest was swift, silent, and devastating. Word spread faster than official statements. By sunrise, Bay Harbor was in collective disbelief. Parents stared at their children's coaches in a new light. Neighbors replayed memories, searching for warning signs that never existed. The man who had once carried injured pets to the vet, who had shoveled driveways after storms, who had stood solemnly at Emily's memorial services, was now accused of ending her life. Daniel pleaded not guilty. He claimed contamination, mishandled evidence, a conspiracy born of desperation. His attorney argued that DNA alone, after more than a decade, could not outweigh a spotless record and a lifetime of service. The town split open along invisible fault lines, belief clashing violently with evidence, loyalty colliding with logic. But beneath the public spectacle, investigators began unearthing a hidden version of Daniel Hargreave, one that existed only in sealed complaints, unfiled reports, and whispered warnings that no one had connected in time. A pattern of unsettling behavior. Late-night sightings near the marina. Uncomfortable encounters dismissed as misunderstandings. A trail of unease stretching back years, ignored because it did not fit the image of the man everyone thought they knew. And still, one question refused to be silenced. If Daniel was the killer, how had he remained hidden for so long, embedded so deeply in the fabric of the town that no one, not even seasoned detectives, had seen him clearly? The answer lay buried in the forgotten details, the overlooked testimonies, the moments that never made headlines, the fragments of truth scattered across 11 years of silence. And as Bay Harbor braced for a trial that would reopen every wound, one chilling reality settled over the community like a suffocating fog. The most dangerous monsters do not arrive from the outside. They grow quietly among us. And by the time we recognize them, it is already far too late. The moment Daniel Hargreave was led into the courthouse in handcuffs, Bay Harbor seemed to fracture along invisible seams, a town split between those who clung to the memory of the man they thought they knew and those who stared at the evidence with a cold, sinking certainty, the kind that rearranges your understanding of the world in a single, brutal instant. Because if someone like Daniel could hide something so monstrous for more than a decade, then no face could ever be trusted again, no smile could ever be taken at its word, and every familiar street suddenly felt like unfamiliar territory. Inside the investigation room, the atmosphere was thick with urgency and dread as detectives reopened every sealed box, every dust-coated envelope, every overlooked transcript from 2007, now illuminated under the harsh fluorescent glare of modern scrutiny, and what emerged was not a sudden revelation but a slow, horrifying accumulation of detail, small moments that had once seemed harmless, now aligning into a picture that made too much sense to ignore. Neighbors recalled Daniel walking alone near the marina late at night, claiming he found the sound of water calming. A former coworker remembered him showing unusual interest in missing person cases, asking questions that lingered uncomfortably long. A waitress at the diner hesitated before admitting he had been there the night Emily disappeared, sitting in a corner booth, nursing black coffee, watching her as she cleaned tables, leaving minutes before her shift ended. None of it had raised alarms back then. It had all blended into the background noise of ordinary life. Now, every fragment felt radioactive. Detectives reconstructed Daniel's movements on the night of the murder with forensic precision, tracking cell phone pings, fuel receipts, and radio logs, revealing a narrow window of unaccounted time between 1:10 and 2:50 a.m., a gap wide enough to swallow a life. Surveillance cameras along Highway A1A showed his truck heading south toward the marina just after midnight, then reappearing nearly 2 hours later, its headlights cutting through mist rising off the wetlands. When questioned, Daniel claimed he had gone for a drive to clear his head, a habit, he said, left over from his days caring for his terminally ill wife, sleepless nights spent circling empty roads to escape the walls of a quiet house. But the timeline refused to cooperate. Tire impressions near the thicket where Emily's body was found were re-examined, and though degraded by time and weather, they bore patterns consistent with the worn treads of Daniel's truck, a subtle match that carried devastating weight. Soil samples trapped beneath the vehicle's wheel wells matched the unique mineral composition of the Palmetto Grove. Fibers recovered from Emily's clothing aligned with the interior fabric of his passenger seat, a material rare enough to rule out coincidence. The deeper they dug, the more the case tightened its grip. Yet for every fact that pointed toward Daniel, there existed an equal and opposite force: disbelief. Half the town rallied behind him, forming candlelight circles outside the jail, holding signs that declared his innocence, their voices trembling with conviction, because to accept his guilt was to accept that evil had worn a familiar face for decades, had attended their barbecues, their weddings, their funerals, had comforted their children and shared their tables, and that was a reality too unsettling for many to bear. In the midst of this fracture, Emily's mother watched in silence, her grief transformed into a rigid stillness, a woman who had lived for 11 years in a suspended state of mourning, now confronted with the possibility of truth, a truth that promised neither relief nor closure, only a different kind of pain, sharper, more focused, a wound that finally had a name. But then, just as the narrative began to crystallize, a single anomaly threatened to unravel everything. A forensic analyst reviewing the original DNA evidence noticed inconsistencies in the chain of custody records. One evidence bag, logged as sealed, bore markings suggesting it had been reopened months after Emily's death, then resealed without proper documentation. The technician who had handled the sample in 2007 had since retired, her memory of the procedure hazy, her notes minimal. The lab itself had undergone renovations, equipment upgrades, staffing changes. The possibility, however remote, of contamination or mishandling crept into the margins of the case. Defense attorneys seized on it instantly. They argued that the DNA match, the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, was compromised, that years of storage in outdated facilities had degraded the sample, that cross-contamination could have occurred during retesting, that Daniel was being framed by circumstance and coincidence, his reputation sacrificed on the altar of public hunger for resolution. The courtroom transformed into a battleground where science and doubt collided, where expert witnesses debated statistical probabilities and molecular integrity, their testimonies dense with technical language that obscured as much as it clarified. Jurors listened, brows furrowed, as two narratives unfolded simultaneously, one of overwhelming evidence, the other of fragile uncertainty. And still, beneath the legal theater, another investigation unfolded, quieter, more dangerous, driven by the fear that if Daniel was innocent, the true killer remained free. Detective Wolf authorized a full-scale re-examination of alternative suspects, reopening files long considered dead. They scrutinized former co-workers, distant acquaintances, transient laborers, anyone who had crossed Emily's path in the weeks before her death. A truck driver who had passed through town. A drifter arrested months later in Georgia. A local fisherman with a history of violent outbursts. Each was pulled into the orbit of suspicion, interrogated, tested, eliminated. Except one. A name buried deep in the archives surfaced with unsettling persistence: Marcus Lane. In 2007, Marcus had been 23, recently released from county jail after serving time for assault. He lived in a trailer park less than a mile from the diner. Witnesses had reported seeing him loitering near the parking lot on the night Emily vanished, but the tip had been dismissed after he produced a shaky alibi involving a late-night card game. No physical evidence had tied him to the crime. No DNA. No eyewitnesses. He faded into the background, swallowed by the sheer volume of leads. Now, when detectives revisited his file, they discovered a disturbing pattern of escalation: arrests for stalking, restraining order violations, harassment, all targeting young women who resembled Emily. He had moved frequently, leaving a trail of uneasy encounters across 3 states. His DNA, however, did not match the sample from Emily's clothing. At least, not completely. Partial markers showed similarities, genetic echoes that hinted at possible contamination, sample mixing, or a rare coincidence. The lab insisted the match to Daniel remain definitive, but the existence of a partial overlap reopened the door to doubt, and with it, the terrifying possibility that the investigation itself had become compromised. As the trial date approached, pressure mounted on every front. Journalists flooded Bay Harbor. Satellite trucks lined the streets. Every development was dissected in real time, transformed into headlines that traveled far beyond the town's boundaries. The story became a national obsession. The beloved volunteer firefighter accused of a brutal murder, the small town forced to confront its own mythology. Then, just weeks before jury selection, a new witness stepped forward. She was an elderly woman named Ruth Mallory, a former dock worker who had lived alone near the marina in 2007. She claimed that on the night of Emily's death, she had been awakened by shouting, had peered through her window, and seen a man arguing with a young woman beside a silver car. She had thought it was a domestic dispute, something best ignored. Fear and age had kept her silent. Now, watching Daniel's arrest on television, she felt compelled to speak. Her description of the man, however, did not match Daniel. He was taller, leaner, his hair longer, his gait unremarkable, no limp. The revelation sent shockwaves through the prosecution's case. Detectives rushed to re-interview her, but memory is a fragile instrument, warped by time and emotion, and her account shifted with each retelling. Sometimes the man limped. Sometimes he did not. Sometimes the car was silver. Sometimes it was dark blue. The more she tried to recall, the less certain her memories became, eroding their own credibility. Still, doubt had been injected into the narrative, and doubt, once introduced, is impossible to contain. Daniel's defense pushed aggressively, portraying him as the victim of investigative tunnel vision, a convenient scapegoat chosen because his physical impairment matched a blurry silhouette. They highlighted every inconsistency, every lost record, every procedural flaw, weaving a story of systemic failure and desperate overreach. Behind closed doors, prosecutors agonized over their strategy, weighing the risk of proceeding with a case that, while powerful, was no longer airtight. Emily's mother sat through these deliberations like a ghost, her hands clenched, her eyes hollow, caught between the terror of conviction and the even greater terror of acquittal. Because if Daniel walked free, the town would not only lose its chance at justice, it would inherit a legacy of irreversible doubt, a permanent fracture between belief and evidence that could never be fully healed. In the days leading up to the trial, Detective Wolf returned alone to the marina, standing beneath the same broken streetlight, watching the water pulse against the docks, replaying every decision, every assumption, every leap of logic that had led them here. He studied the shadows, imagined the echo of footsteps, the soft click of a car door, the brief, violent convergence of 2 lives. And in that silence, he confronted the most devastating truth of all. Even if they secured a conviction, even if Daniel was guilty beyond all reasonable doubt, the years lost to inaction, to missed connections, to the slow erosion of urgency, meant that the full story of Emily Carter's final moments would remain forever incomplete, a narrative riddled with blanks no technology could fill, no confession could fully illuminate. Because time is the most efficient accomplice any killer could ever have. As the sun rose over Bay Harbor on the morning of jury selection, Its golden light spilled across the streets, illuminating banners, cameras, faces strained with anticipation, a town holding its breath, suspended between justice and despair, knowing that whatever verdict awaited them, the shadow of that flickering silhouette at 2:17 a.m. would never truly fade. That some part of the night Emily disappeared would remain sealed in darkness, a question mark etched into the collective memory of everyone who called this place home. And beneath the spectacle, beneath the arguments, beneath the headlines, one fragile hope persisted, trembling but unextinguished. That somewhere within the tangled web of evidence, doubt, and human error, the truth still waited to be uncovered.
Silent.
Patient. Unforgiving. The courtroom air was dense with anticipation, a charged stillness vibrating beneath whispered conversations and the soft rustle of legal documents as 12 jurors filed into their seats, carrying the invisible weight of a town's fractured faith, knowing that every word spoken in this room would ripple far beyond its walls, reshaping memories, rewriting loyalties, and deciding whether Bay Harbor would finally confront its darkest hour or retreat once more into the uneasy comfort of uncertainty. The prosecution opened with a narrative of precision, each detail placed deliberately, each piece of evidence assembled into a relentless sequence that led, inexorably, toward Daniel Hargreave. They walked the jury through the timeline, the surveillance footage, the DNA match, the soil samples, the tire impressions, the fibers, building a structure of logic so dense it felt almost impenetrable. They showed enlarged stills of the blurred silhouette, tracing the subtle drag of the left foot, overlaying it with medical records documenting Daniel's knee injury. They played recordings of radio logs, highlighting the unaccounted window of time, the silence that swallowed Emily's final moments. Then they turned to motive, and here, the story darkened. Psychological experts testified about patterns of fixation, about how certain individuals embed themselves within community structures not out of altruism, but out of camouflage, using visibility as invisibility, transforming public trust into a shield behind which private obsessions can thrive. They described how grief, loneliness, and unresolved trauma can distort desire into control and control into violence. They did not name Daniel, but the implication hovered, heavy and unavoidable. The defense countered with a surgical dismantling of certainty. They questioned the integrity of the evidence, the gaps in documentation, the decades-old storage conditions. They summoned forensic specialists who spoke of degradation, of contamination, of statistical margins so thin they could not support the weight of a life sentence. They emphasized the partial DNA overlap with Marcus Lane, framing it as proof that the sample itself was compromised, a corrupted foundation upon which the prosecution had built an elaborate but unstable case. They presented Daniel as a man defined by service and loss, a widower who had nursed his wife through terminal illness, who had volunteered tirelessly in the aftermath of hurricanes, who had responded to hundreds of emergency calls, often risking his own life for strangers. They paraded character witnesses who spoke of kindness, of generosity, of quiet strength, their voices trembling as they described a man they could not reconcile with the monster painted by the state. As the trial progressed, testimony unfolded like a slow, relentless tide, eroding certainty from both sides until the narrative became less about guilt or innocence and more about the limits of truth itself, about how memory fractures under pressure, how evidence decays, how even the most meticulous investigations are haunted by what they cannot recover. Then, in the third week, everything changed. A former crime scene technician named Elaine Porter took the stand, her hands shaking as she adjusted the microphone, her eyes avoiding the gallery. She had worked the Emily Carter scene in 2007, processing the body, collecting samples, logging evidence. She had left law enforcement 2 years later, disillusioned, burned out, carrying a burden she had never fully articulated. Under oath, she admitted to a procedural violation. On the night of the autopsy, overwhelmed by the volume of cases and understaffed beyond capacity, she had temporarily stored Emily's clothing on a shared stainless steel table, adjacent to materials from an unrelated assault case processed earlier that day. The surfaces had been cleaned, she insisted, but not sterilized to laboratory standards. It had been a shortcut, a small one, a moment of fatigue. One she had convinced herself was inconsequential. A collective inhale rippled through the courtroom. The defense surged forward, dissecting every second of her testimony, reconstructing the possibility of DNA transfer, painting contamination not as a remote theoretical risk, but as a plausible explanation for the entire genetic foundation of the case. They argued that if even a trace of foreign DNA had migrated onto Emily's clothing, then every subsequent match was irreparably tainted, the scientific equivalent of a house built on shifting sand. The prosecution fought back, emphasizing the multiple independent lines of evidence, the consistency of the profile across samples, the improbability of coincidental overlap, but the damage was done. Doubt, once again, had found a foothold. Outside, the town erupted. Protesters gathered on opposite sides of the courthouse steps, signs clashing like ideological weapons. Some demanded justice for Emily. Others demanded freedom for Daniel. Families avoided eye contact in grocery aisles. Longtime friendships fractured under the strain of irreconcilable belief. Bay Harbor became a microcosm of a larger cultural war, where truth itself seemed negotiable, contingent, endlessly debated. Yet beneath the noise, another thread quietly unraveled. Detective Wolfe, unsettled by Elaine Porter's admission, ordered a comprehensive audit of every piece of physical evidence connected to the case, reconstructing the chain of custody down to the smallest detail. He wanted certainty, not victory. In the depths of the evidence archive, buried beneath misfiled folders and obsolete labeling systems, an envelope surfaced that should not have existed. Inside lay a single strand of hair, uncatalogued, untested, forgotten. The label, barely legible, read, Marina Doc B, July 14, 2007. The night Emily died. The hair was sent for analysis. Days later, the results arrived. The mitochondrial DNA did not belong to Emily. It did not belong to Daniel. It did not belong to Marcus Lane. It belonged to an unknown individual, male, genetically distinct, a silent witness to a crime that had remained incomplete for 11 years. The revelation detonated through the investigation. Suddenly, the narrative split into divergent possibilities. Either the hair was unrelated, an artifact of a busy public space, or it represented the presence of a second individual, a complicating variable that threatened to collapse the binary logic of prosecution versus defense. Wolfe expanded the scope, ordering a renewed canvass of the marina, the diner, the surrounding neighborhoods, searching for anyone who had lived, worked, or traveled through Bay Harbor in 2007 and matched the genetic profile's ancestral markers. The database produced a list of distant relatives scattered across the Southeast, none with direct ties to Daniel, none previously investigated. One name, however, surfaced repeatedly in peripheral records: Thomas Reddick. In 2007, Thomas had been a 35-year-old seasonal dockhand, hired temporarily during the busy summer months. He had lived out of his truck, drifting between marinas along the Gulf Coast, a ghost in the transient economy of tourism. His employment records were sparse. His background checks superficial. He had left Bay Harbor 2 days after Emily's death. At the time, no one had noticed. Now, detectives tracked him through a labyrinth of outdated addresses, expired phone numbers, and forgotten employers, until a lead finally emerged from a small town in southern Louisiana where a man matching his description had been arrested in 2012 for assault, then released on parole. When they found him, Thomas was gaunt, hollow-eyed, his life reduced to a series of temporary shelters and labor gigs. He denied knowing Emily, denied being near the marina that night, denied everything. But his DNA, taken reluctantly, told a different story. It matched the hair. The courtroom, unaware of these developments, continued its daily ritual of testimony and argument, inching toward a verdict that might soon become irrelevant. Behind the scenes, prosecutors faced an impossible dilemma: proceed against Daniel with a case now fractured by uncertainty, or pivot toward a new suspect whose involvement, while suggestive, was far from definitive. The implications were staggering. If Thomas Reddick had been present, had he acted alone? Had Daniel been falsely accused? Or had both men intersected in a convergence of chance and intent, their paths colliding in a way that defied simple explanation? As investigators raced against the clock, the town remained suspended in a state of emotional vertigo, each headline amplifying confusion, each rumor deepening the divide. Emily's mother watched the spectacle unfold with quiet devastation, her hope now entangled with dread, knowing that every new revelation, no matter how promising, pushed true closure further from reach. And in the midst of this chaos, a final, chilling possibility began to take shape. That the night of July 14th, 2007, had not been a singular act of violence, but a convergence of hidden lives, intersecting briefly in darkness, leaving behind a puzzle so complex that no single truth could ever fully contain it. Because sometimes the most haunting mysteries are not defined by what we know, but by the unbearable realization of how much we never will. The revelation of a second DNA profile did not bring clarity. It detonated the fragile architecture of certainty the case had slowly built, scattering it into 1,000 irreconcilable fragments, each demanding explanation, each whispering a different version of the truth. Within hours, the courtroom drama faded into the background, eclipsed by a far more dangerous pursuit unfolding beyond the reach of cameras and microphones, where investigators scrambled through old records, decaying memories, and half-buried evidence, chasing the shadow of a man who might never have been meant to be found. Thomas Reddick's arrest in Louisiana came without spectacle, no press, no sirens, just two unmarked vehicles idling outside a weather-beaten duplex, their engines humming softly in the humid dusk, waiting for a man who had spent most of his life vanishing into the margins. When he stepped outside, cigarette dangling from his lips, eyes narrowed against the fading light, there was no visible shock, no sudden panic, only a slow, weary exhale, as if some long-deferred reckoning had finally arrived. In the interrogation room, Thomas was an exercise in contradictions. He spoke in fragments, stories drifting in and out of coherence, his past a blur of seasonal labor, transient friendships, and nameless towns stitched together by highways. He admitted to being in Bay Harbor in July 2007, admitted to working the docks, admitted to sleeping in his truck near the marina. But when pressed about Emily, his voice hardened, his gaze drifting toward the stained ceiling tiles, his answers shrinking into silence. Detectives applied pressure with relentless precision. They laid out the DNA evidence, the forgotten strand of hair, the timeline, the abrupt departure. Each detail tightened the room, squeezing away the possibility of coincidence. Still, Thomas refused to confess. He claimed the hair could have transferred through casual contact. He said he brushed against hundreds of people every week. He suggested he might have helped Emily with her car, a vague gesture toward chivalry that collapsed under scrutiny when no mechanical issues were ever documented. Yet something about him unsettled the investigators, a subtle discord between his words and the rhythm of his body, a nervous twitch in his fingers, a barely perceptible sway when certain questions were asked. This was not innocence, but neither was it a confession. As Thomas remained locked in procedural limbo, the prosecution faced an impossible decision. With Daniel's trial already underway, any sudden shift in narrative risked catastrophic collapse. Yet withholding potentially exculpatory evidence would constitute a violation so severe it could erase the entire case. After a night of brutal deliberation, they did the unthinkable. They requested a mistrial. The courtroom erupted. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters surged toward exits, phones already raised. Emily's mother sat motionless, her face draining of color as 11 years of anticipation evaporated in a single sentence. Daniel's supporters cheered. His family wept. His defense attorneys stared in stunned disbelief, their carefully constructed strategy reduced to rubble. The judge granted the motion. Just like that, the most consequential trial in Bay Harbor's history dissolved into a procedural vacuum, leaving behind only questions, accusations, and the corrosive residue of mistrust. Daniel was released on bail within hours. The image of him stepping back into daylight, blinking against the sun, became an instant symbol of the town's unraveling. To some, he was a vindicated man. To others, a monster temporarily freed. To everyone, he was a reminder that certainty, once broken, rarely repairs cleanly. As Bay Harbor reeled, investigators turned their full attention toward reconstructing the night of July 14th with renewed urgency, no longer bound by a single suspect, no longer anchored to a single narrative. They revisited the marina, mapping sight lines, calculating distances, simulating movements through darkness and obstruction. They re-examined the diner footage, noting not just who was present, but who was absent, the subtle rhythms of late-night activity that might have concealed an anomaly. Slowly, a new theory emerged, one so unsettling it threatened to eclipse every prior assumption. Emily, it appeared, may not have been targeted. She may have simply crossed paths with something already in motion. Evidence suggested that Thomas Reddick had been involved in a string of thefts along the Gulf Coast, targeting unattended boats, storage units, and marina offices, crimes rarely reported, often absorbed as insurance losses or chalked up to transient misfortune. On the night of Emily's death, security logs showed a brief alarm trigger at Dock B at 1:47 a.m., a disturbance dismissed at the time as a system malfunction. Now, in retrospect, it suggested a failed burglary attempt, a momentary breach of silence that may have placed Emily in the wrong place at the worst possible moment. If Emily had driven to the marina for any reason, to meet someone, to clear her head, to retrieve a forgotten item, she could have stumbled into a crime in progress, transforming herself from passerby to liability in a matter of seconds. But this theory collided violently with the DNA linking Daniel to the scene. To reconcile the two, investigators began exploring a darker, more complex possibility that two men unknown to each other had converged upon the same isolated location within the same narrow window of time, their independent intentions colliding into catastrophe. A coincidence so extreme it bordered on the unbelievable. And yet, the evidence refused to dismiss it. Phone records placed Daniel's truck near the marina between 1:30 and 2:10 a.m. Thomas's presence was confirmed at Dock B around 1:47 a.m. Emily vanished between 12:43 and 2:17. Three trajectories intersecting within a 40-minute corridor beneath a broken streetlight in a town that had gone to sleep unaware. The more investigators reconstructed these overlapping timelines, the more the night seemed to warp, events folding into each other in ways that defied clean causality, suggesting a cascade of chance encounters and split-second decisions that no single narrative could contain. As the theory evolved, so did the psychological profiles. Daniel's history of subtle boundary violations, the quiet unease expressed by women who had never formally complained, his late-night wanderings, his fixation on tragedy, all suggested a man teetering on the edge of darker impulses, a private world hidden behind civic virtue. Thomas's record of petty crime, aggression, and instability painted a portrait of desperation and volatility, a man capable of violence when cornered. Two unstable paths, converging in darkness. But which had crossed the final line? Or had they both? The question gnawed at the heart of the investigation, transforming it from a search for a killer into an attempt to untangle a knot of overlapping culpability, where motive, opportunity, and action blurred into a single indistinct shape. Then came the call. A woman in Pensacola, her voice trembling, reported discovering a box of old belongings while cleaning out a deceased relative's storage unit. Inside, she had found a collection of items that did not belong to her family, a silver Honda Civic key fob, a faded diner receipt dated July 14, 2007, and a crumpled flyer bearing Emily Carter's photograph. The unit had belonged to her late brother, Thomas Reddick. The items were rushed to Bay Harbor under armed escort. The key fob matched Emily's car. The receipt placed Thomas within minutes of her last known location. The flyer suggested obsession, guilt, or both. When confronted, Thomas collapsed. His confession, halting and fragmented, spilled into the recording room like a slow hemorrhage of truth. He admitted to attempting a burglary at Dock B. He admitted to seeing Emily's car. He admitted to panicking when she confronted him, to grabbing her arm, to struggling, to a moment of violent chaos he claimed spiraled beyond control. But he denied killing her. He insisted she was alive when he fled. He insisted someone else had intervened. Someone who watched. Someone who waited. Someone who finished what he could not. The room fell silent. Detectives replayed the surveillance footage, the flickering silhouette, the limp, the blurred shape crossing the empty street. Two figures. One moment. One impossible overlap. The investigation had reached a precipice. If Thomas's confession was truthful, Daniel's DNA at the scene could no longer be dismissed as contamination or coincidence. It suggested presence.
Proximity.
Involvement. But involvement in what? A rescue attempt? A confrontation? Or the final, fatal act? As the town spiraled into renewed chaos, investigators prepared to reopen the case against Daniel, now armed with a narrative that no longer fit simple categories of guilt or innocence, but instead painted a picture of cascading failure, where multiple lives, burdened by secrecy and desperation, collided in a narrow corridor of time, producing a tragedy no single person could fully claim. And in the center of it all remained the silent absence of Emily Carter, her final moments still fractured across conflicting testimonies, her voice lost to the dark, her story unfinished. Because some crimes do not reveal their truth in a single confession. They emerge slowly, painfully, through layers of contradiction, until what remains is not certainty, but the unbearable weight of complexity. Ann Bay Harbor, once a town defined by simplicity, would soon learn that complexity can be the cruelest verdict of all. The confession did not bring relief. It detonated a new kind of terror, one far more corrosive than uncertainty, because now the truth was no longer hidden in darkness, but fractured into competing realities, each one capable of destroying what remained of Bay Harbor's fragile sense of order.
Two men. Two timelines.
Two versions of the same night, colliding at a single, irreparable point. And in between them, the silent, irrevocable absence of Emily Carter. Investigators dissected Thomas Reddick's confession frame by frame, parsing every hesitation, every shift in tone, every pause between words, searching for the seams where deception might hide. His account painted the marina as a place of chaotic convergence, the alarm triggered, his frantic scramble to escape, the sudden appearance of a young woman demanding to know what he was doing near her car, the shock of confrontation erupting into violence. He described grabbing Emily's wrist, her screams slicing through the night, the panic that followed as footsteps echoed nearby, approaching too fast to ignore. In his version, he fled into the mangroves, heart hammering, convinced someone else had intervened, someone who would later ensure his silence by finishing what he had started. Yet fear is a masterful editor of memory, rearranging moments to soften guilt, to redirect blame, to carve out a version of survival that feels tolerable. Detectives pressed him, replaying his statements, challenging inconsistencies, confronting him with the evidence he had not yet seen. They showed him the surveillance footage, the silhouette, the limp, the unmistakable outline of a second presence crossing the street minutes after Emily vanished. Thomas stared at the screen, his jaw tightening, his breath growing shallow, and for a moment, the mask slipped. He whispered a name. Daniel. The interrogation room seemed to contract, its walls pressing inward, as if the truth itself were struggling to contain the weight of that single word. Thomas claimed he recognized the firefighter from around town, a man everyone knew, a man whose presence near the marina would not have drawn attention. He said he saw Daniel emerge from the shadows, heard him shout, felt the sudden shift in power as the situation spiraled beyond his control. He insisted he ran, driven by instinct, leaving Emily behind, alive, crying, reaching. If true, the implications were devastating. Daniel's DNA, the fibers, the soil, the tire tracks, the limp, all of it snapped into place, not as circumstantial suggestions, but as fragments of a violent convergence. The prosecution's case, once fragile, began to solidify into something far darker than anyone had imagined. Not a lone predator, but a collision of hidden lives, intersecting at the worst possible moment. But truth does not reveal itself so easily. Defense attorneys immediately dismantled Thomas's claims, framing them as a desperate attempt to deflect responsibility, to reduce his own culpability by sharing it with a man already tainted by suspicion. They highlighted his criminal history, his documented patterns of deception, his incentive to minimize his role. They argued that invoking Daniel's name was the final act of a man cornered, a calculated betrayal designed to fracture an already weakened case. Yet as investigators continued to peel back the layers of Thomas's past, a chilling pattern emerged. Across 3 states, over nearly a decade, he had been linked to a series of late-night confrontations near marinas, parking lots, and isolated roadways, incidents marked by sudden violence, opportunistic theft, and abrupt disappearances. None had resulted in homicide. None had garnered national attention. But all bore the signature of impulsive aggression, the volatile mix of fear and entitlement that erupts when a fragile sense of control is threatened. Emily's death, in this context, no longer appeared as an anomaly, but as an escalation. Simultaneously, a parallel investigation unfolded into Daniel's private life, one that unearthed a hidden geography of discomfort and silence. Women came forward, cautiously at first, then in trembling waves, recounting encounters that had once felt too ambiguous, too subtle, too socially inconvenient to report. Late-night knocks at the door. Lingering stares. Conversations that drifted into unsettling territory before snapping back into polite normalcy. Offers of help that carried an undercurrent of expectation. Each story alone seemed insufficient. Together, they formed a map of unease that stretched back years. None accused him of violence, but all described a man who hovered too close to invisible boundaries, whose empathy seemed to flicker unpredictably into something darker, more possessive, more consuming. Psychologists consulted by the task force spoke of duality, of individuals who cultivate public virtue to conceal private obsession, of the slow accumulation of internal pressure that seeks release in moments of perceived vulnerability. They cautioned against oversimplification, against the seductive logic of clean narratives. Human behavior, they warned, is rarely singular. It is a convergence of impulses, histories, and circumstance, colliding in moments of catastrophic consequence. And nowhere was that convergence more evident than in the final reconstruction of Emily's last hour. Digital forensics recovered fragments of data long thought lost, corrupted GPS logs, partial call records, stray pings bouncing between towers. Together, they traced a subtle deviation from Emily's usual route home. Instead of heading directly north, she had turned east, toward the marina, a detour that added 12 minutes to her drive. Investigators searched her phone for clues, uncovering a deleted text thread, its fragments suggesting a request to meet, a brief exchange that ended abruptly minutes before her disappearance. The sender's number was unregistered, prepaid, disposable. Yet cell tower triangulation placed the device near Dock B at 1:42 a.m. The same moment Thomas triggered the alarm. The same narrow corridor of time in which Daniel's truck entered the area. 3 signals. 1 location. 1 night. The possibility that Emily had been lured to the marina began to crystallize, transforming her from an accidental witness into an intended presence, a shift that redefined motive and shattered the lingering hope of random tragedy. But who had summoned her?
And why?
When confronted, Thomas denied contacting Emily. His phone records supported the claim. Daniel, when questioned, offered a fractured explanation. He admitted to exchanging messages with her weeks earlier about a charity fundraiser, insisted they had no ongoing communication, and claimed no memory of texting her that night. But the data told a different story, one of fragmented transmissions and abrupt deletions, the digital equivalent of a voice calling from behind a locked door. Forensic analysts reconstructed the exchange using residual network logs, revealing a chillingly mundane invitation. Can we talk? Just for a minute. No threats. No coercion. Just a request, stripped of context, heavy with implication. Investigators hypothesized a scenario in which Daniel, driven by obsession, summoned Emily under the guise of concern or assistance, only to arrive at the marina and find chaos already unfolding, Thomas's botched burglary colliding with his own secret intentions. In that convergence, panic and impulse could have fused into lethal action, a moment where lines blurred beyond recognition, where fear, desire, and opportunity collapsed into a single irreversible act. But theory is not truth. And truth, in this case, remained maddeningly elusive. As prosecutors prepared to refile charges against Daniel, now bolstered by Thomas's confession and the reconstructed digital trail, the town braced for a second trial, one shadowed by doubt, trauma, and the unbearable awareness that no verdict could ever fully repair what had been broken. Families avoided public spaces. Schools held assemblies on safety. Churches filled with whispered prayers. The marina, once a place of quiet reflection, became a symbol of unease, its empty docks echoing with imagined footsteps long after sunset. Emily's mother stood once more before microphones, her voice steady despite the storm inside her, pleading not for vengeance, but for truth, for an ending that honored her daughter's life rather than sensationalizing her death. She spoke of resilience, of memory, of the unbearable cost of unanswered questions, her words drifting across the crowd like a fragile lifeline in a sea of confusion. Yet even as the machinery of justice resumed its slow, grinding motion, a darker realization began to surface among those closest to the case. That the night of July 14th, 2007, might never be fully reconstructed. That the final moments of Emily Carter's life were scattered across fractured testimonies, corrupted data, and the fallible recollections of two men whose interests lay in distortion rather than clarity. And that in the space between those fragments, something essential had been lost forever. Because sometimes, the most devastating consequence of violence is not the act itself, but the permanent theft of certainty, the knowledge that no matter how fiercely we pursue the truth, some answers will always remain just beyond reach, hovering in the shadows, whispering of what might have been, and what can never be undone. The second trial did not begin with anticipation. It began with exhaustion, a collective weariness that settled over Bay Harbor like a low, unbroken cloud, because by now, hope had been ground into something thinner, something brittle, and every promise of resolution carried the echo of past disappointment. The courthouse stood once more at the center of the storm, its steps worn smooth by the feet of reporters, families, and strangers drawn by the gravity of a story that refused to end, a story that had long ago outgrown the boundaries of a single life and become the defining wound of an entire town. Inside, the prosecution's strategy had evolved. No longer anchored to a singular villain, they now presented a narrative of convergence, a theory that sought to explain how two men, driven by different impulses, had collided in the same isolated space, their separate intentions fusing into a single irreversible outcome. It was a story of chance and obsession, of fear and control, of moments that spiraled too quickly for restraint, and in its complexity lay both its power and its vulnerability. They reconstructed the timeline with merciless precision. The diner, the final wave, the detour toward the marina, the disposable phone, the triggered alarm, Thomas's panicked flight, Daniel's arrival, the broken streetlight casting warped shadows across the asphalt. Each event stacked upon the next, forming a cascade of inevitability that led, step by step, toward Emily's death. They argued that Daniel had summoned Emily under false pretenses, exploiting her trust, drawing her into isolation, and that upon encountering Thomas's intrusion, the situation had detonated into violence, a convergence of motives that left no room for innocence. They played the reconstructed text exchange. They displayed the overlapping GPS data. They projected the surveillance footage, slowing the frames until the courtroom seemed to hold its breath, the limp unmistakable, the silhouette crossing into darkness, the final movement before the night swallowed everything. But the defense countered with equal force, dismantling the narrative's foundations, challenging every assumption, every inference, every leap across gaps where evidence dissolved into conjecture. They portrayed Daniel as a man ensnared by coincidence, his proximity transformed into guilt by the sheer magnitude of tragedy, his digital traces misinterpreted through the lens of desperation. They emphasized the absence of eyewitnesses, the contradictions in Thomas's confession, the compromised DNA, the possibility that the text message could have been sent by anyone, the prepaid phone, an anonymous phantom no one could reliably trace. They reminded the jury, relentlessly, that complexity is not proof. As testimony unfolded, the trial became a theater of uncertainty, each witness adding detail while subtracting clarity until the truth itself seemed to fragment under the weight of interpretation. Experts debated probabilities. Analysts dissected data. Psychologists unraveled motives. But beneath the intellectual rigor, a deeper tension pulsed, the unspoken recognition that no explanation, no matter how elegant, could fully reconstruct a moment shattered by fear and chaos. Then came the witness no one expected. A former volunteer firefighter named Miguel Alvarez stepped forward, his voice trembling as he recounted a memory he had suppressed for more than a decade, a memory that had returned unbidden in the weeks following Daniel's arrest, clawing its way back into consciousness with relentless insistence. On the night of Emily's death, Miguel testified he had been monitoring the radio channel when he heard Daniel's call come through, not the official alert logged at 3:12 a.m., but an earlier transmission, brief, fragmented, filled with static, a request for assistance that vanished before dispatch could respond. He had assumed it was interference. Now he was no longer sure. When asked why he had not reported it sooner, Miguel lowered his gaze, admitting that he had convinced himself it was nothing, that the memory had blurred with time, that doubt had silenced him. The courtroom absorbed his words in a hush so deep it felt unnatural, the kind of silence that signals a collective recalibration of reality. If Daniel had reached out earlier, during the critical window, what had prompted that call?
Panic? Confusion?
Or the dawning realization that something had gone irreversibly wrong? The prosecution seized upon this revelation, framing it as evidence of immediate consciousness of guilt, a reflexive attempt to summon help after violence had already unfolded. The defense attacked its reliability, highlighting the absence of any recording, the fallibility of memory, the ease with which suggestion can rewrite recollection over time. Yet the seed had been planted. As days blurred into weeks, the trial took on the rhythm of attrition, each side chipping away at the other, eroding certainty grain by grain, until the jurors' faces reflected a shared exhaustion, their expressions taut with the strain of navigating a narrative that refused to resolve into simplicity. They were no longer asked merely to weigh evidence. They were asked to inhabit ambiguity, to render judgment in a landscape where absolutes had long since collapsed. Outside, Bay Harbor continued its uneasy vigil. The marina lay mostly deserted after sunset. The diner closed earlier than it once had. Parents waited in their cars for children to finish shifts. Conversations faltered, then resumed in cautious fragments. The town moved, but it did not breathe easily. Emily's mother attended every session, her presence a quiet constant, her eyes fixed on the proceedings with a resolve that bordered on defiance, as though sheer will might summon clarity from chaos. In moments of recess, she walked the courthouse corridors alone, tracing familiar paths worn smooth by grief, carrying a photograph of her daughter folded so tightly it bore the creases of countless touch. And then, in the final week of testimony, the prosecution unveiled its most devastating reconstruction. Using advanced behavioral modeling and forensic simulation, they recreated the sequence of movements within the marina's shadowed corridors, aligning GPS data, surveillance timestamps, and environmental variables to chart a probable chain of events. The model suggested that Daniel arrived moments after Thomas's attempted burglary, that he intercepted Emily near her car, that a confrontation erupted, and that in the ensuing struggle, her airway was compressed, not by deliberate strangulation, but by a panicked restraint that escalated beyond control. It was a theory of unintended lethality, of a fatal mistake rather than premeditated murder. But for Emily, intention made no difference. The defense objected furiously, denouncing the reconstruction as speculative theater, an illusion of precision masking fundamental uncertainty. They argued that the model relied on assumptions layered upon assumptions, that it blurred the line between possibility and proof, seducing the jury with the comfort of coherence in a case defined by fragmentation. The judge allowed the evidence. The room seemed to constrict as the simulation played, abstract figures moving through digital darkness, converging, colliding, separating, their paths tracing the invisible geometry of catastrophe. It was not real, and yet it felt unbearable, a visualization of loss that forced every observer to confront the moment where the night could no longer be undone. Closing arguments followed, each side pouring its remaining strength into narratives polished by months of preparation. The prosecution spoke of responsibility, of convergence, of the impossibility of coincidence, of the moral imperative to acknowledge the weight of presence and action. The defense spoke of doubt, of fallibility, of the dangers of constructing certainty from ambiguity, of the irreversible cost of wrongful conviction. The jury withdrew. Days passed. No verdict. Inside the deliberation room, the fractures mirrored those of the town, belief colliding with skepticism, empathy warring with logic, the weight of a single decision pressing down upon every exchange. They debated the DNA, the text messages, the confession, the witness testimony. They returned to the surveillance footage again and again, staring at the flickering silhouette until it blurred into abstraction, a symbol rather than a person. On the fourth day, a note arrived. Deadlock. The judge ordered further deliberation. Another day passed. Still no verdict. Finally, the foreperson emerged, voice unsteady, eyes shadowed, and delivered the words that would echo through Bay Harbor for generations. Hung jury. The courtroom erupted, a chaotic fusion of gasps, sobs, and murmured disbelief. Emily's mother closed her eyes, her face tightening as if struck, the final collapse of a hope she had carried through 11 years of uncertainty. Daniel sat motionless, his expression unreadable, suspended between relief and dread, knowing that freedom, if it came, would be provisional, forever shadowed by accusation. Thomas watched from a holding cell via video feed, his gaze hollow, the weight of his partial confession pressing inescapably upon his future. The judge declared a mistrial. Once more, the case dissolved into procedural limbo.
Prosecutors vowed to retry.
Defense attorneys prepared to resist. The town sank deeper into emotional paralysis. And somewhere beneath the surface of legal process and public spectacle, the truth retreated further into obscurity, its edges blunted by repetition, its center eroded by time, until what remained was not resolution, but a raw, persistent ache, the knowledge that Emily Carter's final moments might never be fully known, that her death would remain suspended in a state of perpetual interrogation, a question without punctuation. As night fell over Bay Harbor, the broken streetlight at Dock B flickered once more, its unstable glow casting warped shadows across the empty pavement, and for a moment, it seemed as though the past itself hovered in that trembling light, waiting, silent, unresolved, daring anyone to claim they truly understood what had happened beneath its gaze. Because some mysteries do not seek to be solved. They seek to be endured. And in Bay Harbor, endurance had become the only certainty left. The hung jury did not bring silence. It unleashed something far more corrosive, a slow, grinding erosion of trust that seeped into every corner of Bay Harbor, poisoning ordinary life with an unspoken dread, because now the town was no longer waiting for justice, it was learning how to live without it. The courthouse emptied, the cameras packed away, the headlines drifted toward newer tragedies, but the case did not fade. It settled. It embedded itself into the rhythm of daily existence, a constant undertone of unease that hummed beneath conversation, beneath routine, beneath sleep. Daniel Hargreave returned to his house under the watchful gaze of neighbors who no longer knew what they saw when they looked at him. Some waved, stiffly, uncertain. Others turned away. Children were pulled indoors when his truck rolled slowly down the street. Curtains shifted. Doors clicked shut. He walked through it all with a stoic restraint that bordered on numbness, his life reduced to cautious movement and forced normalcy, every step taken under the invisible weight of suspicion. Thomas Reddick remained in custody, facing separate charges for burglary, assault, and obstruction, his partial confession sealing his fate in the eyes of the law, even as it complicated the narrative of Emily's death beyond recognition. He waited in a concrete cell, suspended between accountability and absolution, replaying the night in fragments, his memories looping in distorted cycles, each repetition eroding his certainty until even he could no longer distinguish truth from survival. And in between them, Emily's absence widened. The diner where she had worked closed its doors 6 months after the mistrial, its windows papered over, its parking lot overtaken by weeds. The marina installed brighter lights, security gates, surveillance systems, transforming a once-open space into a fortified perimeter. Annual vigils continued, but attendance thinned, grief slowly giving way to exhaustion, the ritual itself becoming a reminder of futility. Yet beneath the surface, something was shifting. Detective Wolf, unwilling to surrender the case to procedural decay, assembled a small, independent review team, drawing on analysts, behavioral scientists, and forensic specialists who approached the evidence without allegiance to either narrative. Their mandate was not to prove guilt, but to locate certainty, however small, however uncomfortable. They began with the one element that had resisted distortion: the physical environment. Using archived meteorological data, tidal records, and sound propagation models, they reconstructed the conditions of July 14, 2007, simulating how voices, footsteps, and engine noise would have traveled through the marina's labyrinth of docks, storage sheds, and mangroves. What emerged was a chilling insight. The area where Emily's body was found was acoustically insulated, cocooned by dense vegetation and waterlogged soil, a natural sound trap that would have muted screams and obscured struggle. But the path leading there required deliberate navigation, a sequence of turns and narrow corridors invisible from the street, a route familiar only to those who worked the docks or had spent extensive time in the area. Thomas knew it. Daniel did not. At least, not officially. Employment logs confirmed Thomas's regular presence along Dock B, his duties involving maintenance of the very pathways leading into the palmetto thicket. Daniel, as a volunteer firefighter, had responded to multiple incidents at the marina, but none required prolonged exploration of its deeper, more isolated sections. Yet, eyewitness recollections complicated the picture. Several dock workers remembered seeing Daniel there late at night on multiple occasions, often alone, often lingering after routine safety inspections. He had claimed to be checking emergency access points, ensuring preparedness. It had seemed reasonable, responsible, even. Now, it seemed something else. Wolf's team cross-referenced these sightings with Daniel's phone location data, revealing a pattern of nocturnal visits spanning months before Emily's death. The marina was not an anomaly in his routine. It was a destination.
Why?
The answer emerged not through technology, but through confession, a confession that arrived not from a suspect, but from a witness who had carried her silence for over a decade. Her name was Marisol Vega. In 2007, she had been 19, living with her aunt in Bay Harbor, working nights at a bait shop near the docks. She came forward after seeing renewed coverage of the case, her hands shaking as she recounted an encounter that had never left her, an interaction she had buried beneath fear and shame. She described being approached by Daniel one night as she closed the shop, his voice calm, his demeanor friendly, his questions gradually drifting from casual to intimate. He asked about her schedule, her family, whether she felt safe walking home alone. When she declined his offer of a ride, his expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, disappointment hardening into something sharper. He lingered, watching, until she locked herself inside and called her aunt in tears. At the time, she had dismissed it as discomfort, a misread signal. Now, seen through the lens of Emily's death, it took on a darker gravity. Marisol was not alone. 3 other women recounted similar encounters, each story echoing the same pattern: proximity, familiarity, gradual encroachment, withdrawal masked as politeness. None had reported him. None had named him. The town's culture of quiet endurance had absorbed their unease, transforming warning into silence. The psychological profile began to crystallize. Daniel was not a predator in the traditional sense. He did not stalk strangers. He cultivated proximity. He embedded himself within networks of trust, selecting women who existed just beyond the boundaries of protection, whose vulnerability was masked by normalcy. His methods were incremental, patient, and invisible, a slow tightening of emotional space that left little room for alarm. This profile aligned disturbingly well with the reconstructed text message, "Can we talk? Just for a minute." A request that relied on familiarity, on trust, on the absence of fear. Investigators now theorized that Daniel had lured Emily under the guise of concern, perhaps claiming to have found her keys, to have noticed something wrong with her car, to need help with a volunteer event. Whatever the pretext, it had been sufficient. But where did Thomas fit? The convergence theory regained momentum, but now with sharper edges. Evidence suggested Thomas's burglary attempt had occurred minutes before Daniel summoned Emily, a coincidence so catastrophic it defied comprehension. When Emily arrived, Thomas was already in flight, adrenaline flooding his system, his path colliding with hers in the darkness. Their encounter, brief and chaotic, likely left her shaken but alive. And then Daniel arrived. If this reconstruction was correct, Daniel did not interrupt a crime. He inherited its aftermath. A frightened young woman. A disordered scene. An opportunity. The implications were staggering. The task force sought corroboration. They reanalyzed soil displacement patterns around the thicket, discovering two distinct sets of disturbances, one consistent with a rapid retreat, the other with sustained presence. They examined plant breakage angles, concluding that one individual had fled in panic, while another had moved deliberately deeper into the vegetation. They mapped these movements against the timelines. Thomas ran. Daniel stayed. Still, the final act remained hidden. No confession. No eyewitness. Only inference. As Wolf assembled the findings into a new prosecutorial framework, resistance emerged not from the defense, but from within the justice system itself. The district attorney hesitated, wary of pursuing a third trial on a case already fractured by doubt and public scrutiny. Political pressure mounted. Resources dwindled. Fatigue set in. Yet Wolf persisted, driven not by ambition, but by the quiet, unrelenting presence of Emily's memory, a presence that refused to yield to procedural convenience. Then, in an unexpected turn, Daniel himself requested an interview. It took place in a small, windowless room, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence between breaths. He sat with hands folded, posture composed, eyes fixed on a point beyond the far wall, as though addressing a reality no one else could see. He did not confess. He spoke instead of loneliness, of the suffocating quiet that followed his wife's death, of the emptiness that crept into nights, stretching until sleep felt impossible. He spoke of walking the marina to feel movement, to feel connection, to remind himself that the world still existed beyond his own grief. When asked about Emily, his voice faltered just once.
"She was kind," he said.
She listened. It was not an admission, but it was not a denial. As the interview ended, Wolf felt a familiar chill settle across his spine, the recognition that the most dangerous truths are often spoken not in declarations, but in omissions, in the delicate spaces between words. In the months that followed, the task force prepared its final recommendation, a comprehensive synthesis of evidence, analysis, and psychological profiling, urging the state to proceed with renewed charges against Daniel, not as a participant in a convergence, but as the primary agent of a calculated, opportunistic crime. Whether the state would act remained uncertain. But Bay Harbor had already changed. The myth of safety had collapsed. Trust had been irrevocably fractured. And in that fracture, a darker understanding had taken root, that monsters do not always announce themselves with violence, that they often arrive quietly, clothed in familiarity, patience, and need. And when they finally reveal themselves, The damage they leave behind extends far beyond a single life, embedding itself into the very identity of the place they once called home. Because some wounds do not heal. They become the story we tell ourselves about who we are. And in Bay Harbor, that story would forever begin and end with the night Emily Carter vanished into the dark. The state hesitated for nearly a year, suspended in a paralysis born of fear, fatigue, and political caution, because a third trial meant reopening every wound, reliving every failure, and risking a final collapse that would permanently shatter public confidence in the justice system. Yet pressure mounted relentlessly, not from headlines or public outrage, but from a quieter force, the slow, suffocating insistence of unfinished truth. Detective Wolf's final report circulated behind closed doors, its conclusions stark, unflinching, and deeply unsettling. The convergence theory had hardened into a singular trajectory: Daniel Hargreave as the central figure, Thomas Reddick as the chaotic accelerant, and Emily Carter as the tragic fulcrum upon which their lives collided. In the spring of 2020, the district attorney made the call. New charges were filed: second-degree murder,
kidnapping,
obstruction. The announcement fell over Bay Harbor like an approaching storm, heavy, inevitable, and merciless. For some, it brought vindication. For others, despair. For many, exhaustion. But for Emily's mother, it reopened a door she had feared would remain sealed forever, a door leading not to peace, but to confrontation, to the unbearable necessity of once more stepping into the furnace of memory. Daniel was arrested at dawn, the quiet efficiency of the operation standing in stark contrast to the chaos it unleashed. He did not resist. He did not protest. He allowed the handcuffs to close around his wrists with a resigned stillness that unsettled even the officers escorting him. As he was led from his home, the street remained silent, curtains unmoving, neighbors watching from behind glass, the town unwilling to meet his eyes. The third trial began under unprecedented security, a fortress of barricades and patrols encircling the courthouse, not merely to protect the participants, but to contain the emotional volatility that now pulsed through Bay Harbor. This time, there were no illusions of simplicity, no expectation of clean resolution, only the grinding necessity of confrontation. The prosecution abandoned spectacle. Their presentation was restrained, surgical, focused not on shock, but on inevitability. They constructed a narrative of accumulation, showing how Daniel's nocturnal patterns, his incremental boundary violations, his digital footprints, and the physical evidence converged toward a single conclusion: Emily's death was not a random tragedy, nor merely an unintended escalation, but the culmination of a private obsession that had finally crossed the threshold into violence. They introduced Marisol Vega and the other women, whose testimonies traced a map of unease across years, each account echoing the same trajectory of encroachment. They replayed the reconstructed text exchange, the simplicity of the invitation amplifying its menace. They layered the forensic reconstructions, the soil displacement, the fiber matches, the overlapping GPS data, weaving them into a tapestry of presence and opportunity that left little room for coincidence. Thomas Reddick took the stand under immunity for the purposes of testimony, his gaunt frame and hollow gaze a stark embodiment of consequence. His voice trembled as he recounted the burglary, the alarm, the sudden appearance of Emily, the frantic struggle, his flight into the mangroves. And then, haltingly, he described seeing Daniel approach, his silhouette emerging beneath the broken streetlight, his posture calm, deliberate, incongruous with the chaos unfolding before him. He didn't look surprised, Thomas whispered. He looked ready. The courtroom seemed to contract around the words, the air thickening with implication. The defense responded with ferocity, dismantling Thomas's credibility, exposing contradictions, emphasizing the benefits he had received in exchange for cooperation. They attacked the psychological profiling as speculative. They portrayed the women's testimonies as tragic misinterpretations, conflating discomfort with criminality. They framed the prosecution's narrative as a desperate attempt to impose coherence upon a night defined by randomness. Yet this time, something had shifted. The jury listened differently. They were not searching for a singular, definitive moment of guilt. They were tracing patterns. They were weighing accumulation. They were confronting the uncomfortable reality that evil does not always announce itself through grand gestures, but through the slow, almost invisible erosion of boundaries. As the weeks unfolded, Daniel remained impassive, his demeanor a study in controlled detachment. He did not flinch during testimony. He did not react to accusations. He watched the proceedings with a distant calm that unsettled even his attorneys, as though the trial were happening somewhere beyond him, a narrative unfolding about a man he did not fully recognize. When he finally took the stand, the courtroom leaned forward as one.
His voice was steady.
His words carefully measured. He spoke of grief, of isolation, of nights spent wandering the marina to escape the suffocating quiet of his home. He admitted to contacting Emily, framing the message as a benign request, a misguided attempt at connection, born of loneliness rather than malice. He denied harming her, denied restraining her, denied any involvement in her death. But when confronted with the overlapping evidence, with Thomas's testimony, with the physical data, cracks appeared. Subtle, momentary, a hesitation before answering, a fractional tightening of the jaw, averted eyes. The jury noticed. In cross-examination, the prosecution returned to the question of opportunity, of the narrow window in which 3 lives intersected beneath a flickering light. They asked Daniel to describe his exact movements, to explain his presence, to account for the missing minutes. His responses grew increasingly vague, the precision that had once defined his narrative dissolving into abstraction. "I don't remember," he said, again and again. The phrase echoed through the courtroom, a refrain of evasion. And then, unexpectedly, the prosecution played the audio of Miguel Alvarez's testimony, the recollection of the fragmented radio call, the plea for assistance that vanished into static. They asked Daniel to explain it. He paused. For the first time, his composure faltered. "I was confused," he said. "I didn't know what I'd walked into." The words hung in the air, suspended between admission and denial, a statement that acknowledged presence without acknowledging action, a fragile bridge between guilt and innocence. It was enough. Closing arguments unfolded beneath a suffocating tension, the prosecution urging the jury to recognize the convergence of evidence, not as coincidence, but as inevitability, to understand that responsibility does not require premeditation, only choice, and that Daniel's choices, layered across time, had led inexorably to Emily's death. The defense pleaded for restraint, for humility before uncertainty, for the recognition that the absence of absolute proof must weigh heavier than the seduction of narrative. The jury withdrew. This time, deliberations stretched into a grueling week. Inside the jury room, debates raged late into the night, voices rising, falling, fracturing, coalescing, each member wrestling with the moral burden of deciding not only a man's fate, but the meaning of justice itself in a case defined by ambiguity. They revisited evidence until their eyes burned. They replayed testimony until voices blurred. They argued not just about facts, but about thresholds, about how much certainty was enough to condemn. On the 7th day, a knock sounded at the courtroom door. The jury had reached a verdict. Bay Harbor held its breath. Daniel stood as the foreperson rose, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded the slip of paper, her voice barely audible above the hum of anticipation. "We find the defendant, Daniel Hargreave, guilty." The word landed like a thunderclap. Emily's mother collapsed into sobs, her body folding inward as years of restrained grief erupted in a single, shattering release. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Daniel closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging, the first visible crack in the armor he had worn for so long. Thomas bowed his head, a silent acknowledgement of shared culpability, whatever its final measure. The judge ordered the courtroom cleared. Sentencing was scheduled for a later date. Outside, the town erupted into a cacophony of reaction. Tears, shouts, embraces, accusations, relief colliding with rage, certainty with doubt. Some celebrated. Others mourned. Many simply stood in stunned silence, unable to process the finality of a decision that had taken 13 years to reach. Yet beneath the spectacle, a quieter reckoning unfolded. The verdict did not restore Emily. It did not erase the years of fear, the fractures of trust, the erosion of innocence. It offered no comfort to those who still doubted, no absolution for the failures that had allowed a predator to hide in plain sight. It delivered only consequence. And consequence, however necessary, is never the same as closure. As night descended once more upon Bay Harbor, the marina lay bathed in artificial light, its shadows subdued but not erased, and in that uneasy glow lingered the memory of a girl who had walked into darkness and never returned, her story now bound to a verdict, her legacy etched into the conscience of a town that would forever carry the imprint of her loss. Because justice, when it finally arrives, does not heal. It only confirms that the wound was real. And in Bay Harbor, that wound would remain, a silent testament to the cost of looking away, to the danger of familiarity, to the devastating power of a single night to reshape an entire world. The silence inside the interrogation room was thick, oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the distant echo of footsteps in the hallway. The man sitting across the metal table kept his eyes fixed on the surface, his hands folded so tightly his knuckles had turned pale. For hours, he had said nothing. Not a word. Not a denial. Not a confession. Just silence. But silence, in this case, spoke louder than any scream. Outside, the town of Marston Bay was already trembling. News of the arrest had spread like wildfire. Phone screens glowed in the dark of living rooms. Neighbors whispered on porches. Former classmates scrolled through old yearbook photos, staring at the familiar face now flashing across breaking news banners. The unexpected suspect. The man no one had ever questioned. The man who had stood among them for nearly 2 decades, untouched, unexamined, invisible. Inside the station, detectives laid out the evidence piece by piece, slow and methodical, like assembling a skeleton from fragments scattered across time. The fibers from the trunk of his car, preserved in a sealed evidence bag for 19 years, matched the threads found tangled in the victim's fingernails. The partial boot print from the riverbank matched a pair of boots recovered from his garage, their soles worn in a pattern so distinct it might, as well have been a fingerprint. The DNA from beneath her nails, degraded but still alive, sang the same genetic signature as the man now breathing heavily in the chair. The room seemed to shrink with every revelation. He shifted, swallowed hard. His jaw tightened. They showed him the timeline. His phone records placed him near the marsh at the exact hour the victim's car was last seen crossing the bridge. His credit card showed a fuel purchase at a station less than 3 miles from the crime scene, minutes before her disappearance. A witness, once dismissed as unreliable, now remembered seeing his truck idling on the roadside, hazard lights blinking, a lone silhouette standing beside it. Each fact landed like a hammer blow. And still he said nothing. Detectives leaned forward, voices low, controlled, pressing not with anger, but with certainty. They told him the story of the night, reconstructing it so vividly it felt less like an accusation and more like a confession already spoken. The argument, the sudden loss of control, the violent impulse, the panic, the frantic attempt to erase what could never truly be erased. His breathing became shallow. A bead of sweat traced a slow path down his temple. Outside, the victim's family waited. They had aged under the weight of unanswered questions, their lives divided into a before and an after. For 19 years, every holiday had carried a shadow. Every birthday had arrived with the same cruel arithmetic, how old she would have been. How many moments had been stolen. Now hope flickered, once more, fragile and terrifying. In the early hours of morning, the man finally looked up. His eyes were red, hollow. "I didn't mean to kill her," he whispered. The words barely rose above the hum of the lights, but they shattered the room. The confession unraveled slowly, unevenly, like a wound being forced open. He spoke of obsession masked as affection, of jealousy fed by imagination, of a confrontation that spiraled into violence. He described the riverbank, the cold mud beneath his knees, the weight of her body as he dragged it toward the water, the way the current swallowed her whole, carrying away the evidence, leaving behind only unanswered questions. Every detail matched the fragments investigators had pieced together over nearly 2 decades. When he finished, no one spoke. The room was filled with a heavy, aching stillness, the kind that comes when the truth finally arrives, but brings no relief. The news hit Marston Bay like a seismic shock. The suspect was not a drifter, not a shadowy outsider, not a stranger passing through. He was a neighbor, a volunteer, a coach, a man who had waved to parents at school drop-offs, who had attended town meetings, who had shaken hands at church fundraisers. For years, he had existed in plain sight, seamlessly woven into the fabric of everyday life. Now that fabric tore. People stared at one another differently. Trust, once freely given, became fragile. Conversations stalled mid-sentence as realization crept in. If he could hide something this monstrous, who else might be hiding something too? Old memories resurfaced, now tainted. The time he offered to walk someone home. The night he stayed late after practice. The comforting smile that now felt like a disguise. The victim's family received the call just after sunrise. They gathered in the same living room where they had waited countless times before, where hope had been raised and crushed in equal measure. This time, the words did not fade into ambiguity. The detective's voice was steady.
Certain.
They had their answer. Grief returned, but it was different now.
Sharper.
Heavier. No longer suspended in uncertainty, it crashed down with full force. There would be no more wondering. No more imagining alternate endings. Only the final, unbearable truth. At the river, police reopened the crime scene, searching once more along the shifting banks. The water flowed on, indifferent, just as it had 19 years earlier. They recovered fragments, rusted metal, scraps of fabric, small personal items caught in the reeds, each one a haunting echo of a night long buried. Forensic teams moved carefully, their boots sinking into mud that still held the faint memory of violence. Every ripple, every swirl of sediment seemed to whisper of the past. The town watched. Some stood silently on the bridge, staring down at the slow-moving current. Others left flowers and handwritten notes near the shoreline, messages of sorrow and apology to a woman they had never forgotten. As the case files were reopened and the final narrative assembled, a chilling clarity emerged. This had never been a mystery of missing evidence. It had been a mystery of misplaced trust. The man had lived among them, his guilt hidden behind routines and respectability. He had attended memorials. He had consoled grieving relatives. He had spoken of justice while carrying the weight of his own secret. For 19 years, the truth had walked the same sidewalks as its seekers. In court, the confession played across the speakers, his voice trembling, halting, stripped of bravado. Jurors listened in stunned silence. Some wept. Others stared, motionless, as the full gravity of his words settled over them. The verdict came swiftly.
Guilty.
But justice, long delayed, arrived without celebration. There were no cheers, no sense of triumph, only exhaustion, only sorrow, only the hollow understanding that time could not be reversed. For the family, closure did not mean healing. It meant learning how to live with a different kind of pain, the pain of knowing instead of wondering. For the town, it meant rebuilding trust brick by brick, conversation by conversation, learning once more how to look at one another without suspicion. And for the investigators, it meant filing away the last document, sealing the final evidence bag, and standing quietly in the archive room, aware that every solved case still leaves behind unanswered questions of a different kind. Could this have been stopped? Should the signs have been seen? How many other truths were still hidden, waiting for time, persistence, and chance to bring them to light? As night fell over Marston Bay, the river continued its endless journey toward the sea, carrying with it the echoes of what had been lost and what had been found. And somewhere in the hush between passing cars and rustling leaves, The memory of a young woman lingered, a reminder that even when a cold case is solved, its shadow never fully disappears. The courtroom was silent in a way that felt unnatural, as if even the air itself were holding its breath. Every bench was filled. Reporters lined the walls. Cameras waited outside, hungry for the moment when doors would open and the truth would spill into the streets. Inside, all eyes were fixed on the man seated at the defense table, his shoulders hunched, his face drained of color, the weight of 19 stolen years pressing down upon him with merciless force. The confession had already shaken the town to its core, but now came the reckoning. Every word, every detail, every hidden movement of that long-forgotten night was about to be laid bare before strangers, neighbors, and the family whose lives he had shattered. When the prosecutor began to speak, the room seemed to contract. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The facts were devastating enough. She walked the jury back through time, minute by minute, reconstructing the final hours of the victim's life. The drive down the dark highway, the missed calls, the growing tension, the argument that spiraled beyond control, the sudden eruption of violence, the silence afterward, the panic, the desperate, calculated attempt to erase a human being. Photos appeared on the screen behind her. The riverbank, the marsh grass bent and broken, the faint outline where a body had once been dragged. Grainy surveillance footage showed the suspect's truck passing through a gas station, timestamp glowing in the corner like a silent witness. Phone records scrolled by, cold numbers mapping his movements with brutal precision. Each piece fit seamlessly into a puzzle that had taken nearly 2 decades to complete. In the front row, the victim's mother sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap, her gaze locked on the screen. Every image carved another line into her face. Her husband stared straight ahead, unmoving, as though afraid that even blinking might cause him to miss something that mattered. Their daughter's final moments, once an empty void, were now unfolding in merciless detail. The defense tried to soften the narrative. They spoke of emotional instability, of stress, of regret. They spoke of a man who had lived quietly for years, who had built a life, who had become part of the community. They spoke of remorse, of a confession freely given. But the room was unmoved. 19 years of silence outweighed any late apology. When the suspect finally took the stand, the transformation was stark. Gone was the confident local figure, the familiar face at town events. In his place stood a man unraveling under the glare of truth. His voice shook as he described the night, the words tumbling out in broken fragments, as if even now his mind could barely accept what his hands had done. He spoke of losing control, of fear, of a moment he wished he could erase. But the courtroom did not grant him that mercy. The prosecution pressed him on every inconsistency. Why had he attended vigils? Why had he offered comfort to the family? Why had he spoken publicly about justice? His answers faltered. "I wanted to seem normal," he said. The phrase echoed through the room like a confession within a confession. Normal. As if normalcy could be worn like a mask. As if blending in could erase blood from memory. The jury listened in silence, their faces grim, their posture rigid. They did not look at him with hatred. They looked at him with something colder, understanding without forgiveness. Outside, Marston Bay waited. Every cafe, every grocery store, every classroom buzzed with the same question. How could this have happened here? In a town where neighbors borrowed sugar and waved from porches, where children rode bikes through quiet streets, where everyone believed they knew one another. Now, every memory felt suspect. Parents replayed old moments, searching for missed signs. Friends re-examined conversations, gestures, glances, wondering if the truth had been hidden in plain sight all along. Teachers stared at yearbooks. Coaches avoided the empty field where he once stood, whistle around his neck, trusted with the lives of children. The sense of betrayal cut deep. For years, the town had mourned a victim. Now, it mourned its own innocence. When closing arguments ended, the jury retreated behind closed doors. Hours passed. The sun crept lower, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Reporters murmured into microphones. Families paced. Detectives stood quietly, their work complete, their role now reduced to waiting. Inside, the jurors wrestled with the weight of certainty. The evidence was overwhelming, the confession undeniable. Yet the finality of their decision carried an almost unbearable gravity. One by one, they reached consensus. When they returned, the room rose. The verdict was read.
Guilty.
A single word, but it reverberated like thunder. The victim's mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears streamed freely down her face. Her husband closed his eyes, his head bowing, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. 19 years of waiting collapsed into a moment too heavy to contain. The man at the defense table barely reacted. His shoulders sagged, his gaze drifting toward the floor, as if the weight of inevitability had finally crushed what little resistance remained. Sentencing would come later. But in that moment, justice had found its voice. Yet as the courtroom emptied, an unsettling truth lingered. No verdict could restore what had been taken. The years lost. The birthdays never celebrated. The life never lived. Justice, though necessary, felt painfully incomplete. That night, candles flickered once more along the riverbank. The community gathered in silence, their faces illuminated by small, trembling flames. Names were whispered. Prayers were murmured. Some stood alone, staring at the water, as if expecting it to offer an explanation. It did not. The river flowed as it always had, indifferent to human grief, carrying away both sorrow and memory, leaving only the echo of what had been. At the victim's family home, old photographs were laid out across the dining table, smiles frozen in time, moments untouched by tragedy. For the first time in years, they allowed themselves to speak openly about her, not as a missing person, not as a mystery, but as a daughter, a sister, a friend. They laughed. They cried. They remembered. And in remembering, they reclaimed her from the cold anonymity of a case file. For the detectives, the conclusion brought no celebration, only reflection. They revisited every mislead, every overlooked detail, every early assumption. The truth had been there, waiting, buried beneath layers of familiarity and trust. A lesson etched into their memory. Evil does not always arrive as a stranger. Sometimes, it wears the face of a neighbor. As the town of Marston Bay tried to heal, its nights grew quieter, heavier. Porch lights burned a little longer. Doors locked a little sooner. Conversations became more cautious. Trust, once freely given, now demanded proof. The cold case was solved. But its shadows stretched far beyond the verdict. It lingered in empty streets and half-finished sentences, in glances exchanged between old friends, in the uneasy realization that certainty is often an illusion. And in that lingering unease, the town understood a final, haunting truth. Some mysteries end with answers. But no answer can ever fully erase the cost of not knowing.